heart of Manchester at the Tory party conference, and you've just played a clip of the Chancellor telling the party faithful here exactly what they don't want to hear. What they want to hear here is some good red meat, some proper Tory agenda stuff, so tax cuts, and it's exactly the opposite coming from this government. I've just slipped out of a main stage event, which is the Energy Secretary, Claire Coutinho, who is one of Rishi Sunak's protégés, talking about the future of energy security in this country. And after a bit of rambling, she eventually got to a point that actually the audience did like, which is that you cannot force people into net zero, into policies that will make them worse off and expect them to support you. And that did get some muted applause. But really what we have here is a lot of very despondent Tory party faithful, many of whom have paid a lot of money to be here. So they are those that still have some hope in the future of the party and the prospects for winning the next election. But so far, they haven't really heard anything to put a spring in their step.
No, it's all a bit too much like a marketing exercise at the moment, isn't it? Where they're kind of promising things and saying, this is the super-duper new Rishi Sunak kind of action man figure, who, I must say, I don't often give Sir Keir Starmer much credit for his epithets, but in action man I thought was quite good, because he doesn't really do much, does he?
I mean, look, I think the difficulty they've got is that, and this is in common with any kind of dying administration that's been in power for a very long time, is that to listen to the Chancellor on the airwaves this morning and in the excellent interview that he gave the new breakfast show, saying that, you know, we've got to reduce the number of people claiming benefits unnecessarily. Well, look, they've been in power for 13 years, and this was an Ian Duncan Smith agenda when the Tories were in opposition, before David Cameron came in. Ian Duncan Smith did amazing, very, very good work on how to actually get people off benefits and into work. And yet, all these years on, the Tories are promising the same thing, having abjectly failed to deliver it. So it's a really hard sell. And, you know, when you talk to delegates here, the people that have to go out onto doorsteps, candidates, those who've been selected for the party in the next election, their difficulty is, what do they tell voters on the doorstep? What is the selling point? What can they actually persuade people that the Tory party has to offer?
Well, I think that's the big problem, isn't it? Because we now know that after the 13 years, as you say, that they've been in, things appear to have got a lot worse. Now, some of that might not be their fault. Some people might have given them the benefit of the doubt a couple of years ago, but I don't think they do anymore. You know, they can't keep making the same excuse. You might remember for years they made the excuse that, oh, Labour messed it all up. You know, it's all Labour's fault. Even as far on as sort of 2015, and you're kind of going, you can't keep blaming them. Like, you can't keep blaming COVID. You can't keep blaming Brexit. You know, find some solutions.
And looming over the whole thing is the spectre of the small boats, which are actually getting ever bigger boats. And, you know, I was at a party last night at which the Prime Minister briefly spoke, and he actually stood up there and said, we've introduced the toughest yet legislation on small boats. Well, you know, there was sort of applause in the audience. These were his fans, as it were. But in the wider country, it's no use telling people that you've introduced the toughest legislation on small boats, a theoretical achievement, when what they actually see is more small boats coming over every single day. And when you talk to candidates here, when you talk to delegates, to those who are tramping the streets in anticipation of an election next year, trying to persuade people to stick with the Conservative Party, it is the immigration system, both legal migration and illegal, that is the most difficult for them to counter, to come up with any kind of positive argument for why the Conservatives can be trusted to get a grip on this.
Yes, and it must be quite a weird conference. You'll have been to many, many more of these than most people, Isabel, because normally, whenever he wasn't Prime Minister, everyone was waiting to see what Boris Johnson was going to do, and would he come up and, you know, hijack the entire conference by setting himself up in a you know, adjacent theatre and having the biggest audience of the week. Presumably, I hear anyway, he's not coming this week. Has the Boris kind of effect completely disappeared? Do people talk about him anymore?
So what's a bit strange is there was a sort of Boris event last night, and it was probably ironically the most well-attended event at this conference, which was a dinner which was nothing to do with the main agenda, and it was for something called the Conservative Democratic Organisation, which is basically a sort of Boris vehicle. And what was very odd about that, well, first of all, that Boris wasn't there, although he's their kind of figurehead. But secondly, that Nigel Farage was there. And there was Nigel Farage, of course, not of the Conservative Party, but of Reform UK. There was also the keynote speech at that dinner where people had paid tickets as a proper glitzy sit-down event, was from Priti Patel, no longer in government, but very much a darling of the Tory right, who seemed to have spent much of her speech paying tribute to Nigel Farage. So, as always with these conferences, the fun is to be had well away from the main conference hall. It's what's going on in the fringes. And there's an event coming up in about an hour's time with Liz Truss. Remember her, the briefest Prime Minister ever. She is this year's equivalent of Jacob Rees-Mogg or Boris Johnson of the past, the mischief maker at conference. I think Priti Patel is speaking at this event as well. And that will be used, I think, by reporters here to talk about, you know, the split in the Tory party between those who want to go back to a sort of free market, tax-cutting agenda, and, you know, the dismal, that's my interpretation anyway, Jeremy Hunt, who's telling us all that we have to wait and be very sensible. Oh, and by the way, apparently cutting inflation is now a tax cut. That's the best tax cut we could hope for.
Yes.